Shalom, shalom, shalom. It is the second day of the week, July the 6th, 2015, the 20th day of the fourth Hebrew month. And wanted to make a new video about this brand new timeline that I've just posted on the website. I will put a link to this timeline that's on my website underneath this video. This timeline complements the Daniel's 70 weeks timeline that I have. And in this timeline, I go from all the way from Adam's creation all the way down through until the 70th week being fulfilled in 2020 AD. Before I start this, there's three scriptural principles that have to be observed whenever you're going to make a timeline in the Bible. First of all, from the time that Jacob enters into Egypt, there has to be exactly 430 years from that time until the Exodus. And that's recorded in Exodus chapter 12. So that principle has to be kept in any timeline that you create. The second principle is that from the time of the Exodus until the fourth year of King Solomon's reign, when he starts construction on the temple, there has to be 480 years between those two dates. And then the third and final principle, which is not known by many, there's an obscure verse in, I believe it's in First Kings, or actually might be in Judges, that there's actually a period of 300 years between the time of Joshua and the children of Israel entering the Promised Land and the reign of Japheth. So if those three principles can be maintained, then you know you have a solid timeline that accurately reflects the time spans recorded in the Bible. But if your timeline violates any of those three scriptures, which are set in stone, then you know your timeline has some problems. So this timeline that I have here, it actually does abide by all three of those scriptures, and I'm going to show that as we go through this timeline. And I'm really excited about this timeline. This maps out, well, you'll see what it maps out, but it maps out all the judges, all the kings, connects it all the way down through the timeline I already have up for Daniel's 70 weeks. Okay, so this is the full timeline here, full timeline from creation until 2020 AD, when Daniel's 70th week is fulfilled. So here we go. So 4001 BC, we have Adam being created. And then 1,656 years later, which is, you can easily find this time out just by adding up all the years of the, Adam through Noah, when they are born, when they die. And you come to the year 2345 BC, the flood. Then we come to Abraham's birth right here in 2163 BC. And then 75 years later, when he's 75 years old, Abraham begins his sojourn west as Yah leads him toward Canaan, to the future Israel. Then when Abraham is 99 years old in 2064, Isaac is born. When Isaac is 40, Jacob is born. And what's really cool about this timeline is you see that Jacob was able to meet his grandfather Abraham. So I think that's really neat. So anyway, Abraham dies, and then Jacob here in 1894 BC. This is a key date right here. This is when Jacob is 130 years old according to Genesis, and this is when, according to Exodus 12, that the 430-year sojourn of the children of Israel began in Egypt. Remember, Abraham got a dream about this when Yah made a covenant with Abraham way back in here. Abraham was shown that the children of Israel would be down in Egypt for about 400 years. But it'll be exactly 430 years from this date when Jacob comes down into Egypt, and that's 1894. And as you can see in this timeline, the Exodus is 1464. So there's exactly, from 1894 to 1464, there's exactly 430 years. So this timeline maintains that scripture. Then Isaac dies just right here, and then Jacob dies just shortly after Isaac. Isaac, out of all the three patriarchs, lives the longest, which I thought is interesting. And Jacob lives the shortest. Then after Jacob dies, you have about a time span of about 300 years here. And then Moses is born. And then, of course, you have the Exodus right here in 1464. And then about 38 years later, after they wandered in the wilderness, the spies are sent out and give the favorable report. and then 2 years more, so 40 years in the wilderness. This is when they enter the promised land. Of course, this is when Moses dies and they enter the promised land. Then there's 7 years of conquest till 1417 BC. And then here I sort of just guessed that Joshua died. We don't know this, but Joshua, I'm guessing, ruled for 20 years. And actually that guess, I think, proves to be right, because the rest of the timeline seems to fit perfectly with the Judges. A lot of people now get confused with the time of the Judges, because in First Kings, the book of First Kings, when you get to the 4th year of Solomon's reign, when he begins construction of the temple, it says there's been 480 years from that point back toward the time of the Exodus. Well, when you add up all the different judges and then the times between the judges when Israel's oppressed by her enemies, you come up to way more than 480 years between the Exodus and Solomon's 4th year. However, what Yah showed me, and as I started piecing together scriptures, is that many of the judges co-reigned with each other. And this principle of different judges and kings co-reigning with each other happens as late as the Roman Empire. So it's a principle that's very important to understand. The scriptures aren't, they don't come out and say it, but you can kind of piece it together and infer it from different scriptures. So I'm gonna go through this now. So Joshua dies in 1404 is my best guess, and then you have 8 years, according to the scriptures, where Israelites are oppressed by Cushan for 8 years. And then the first judge after Joshua comes on the scene, Othniel, and he kills Cushan, drives back Israel's enemies, and he rules Israel for 40 years. Then you have Eglon, who's another enemy, and he oppresses Israel for another 18 years. And then Ehud, who takes the dagger and stabs Eglon, he delivers Israel and rules Israel for 80 years. That takes us to 1258 BC, where Jabin, the Canaanite, oppresses Israel for 20 years. And then we have Deborah and Barak, and she rules for 40 years as a judge, from 1238 BC to 1198 BC. Then you have the Midianites, who oppress Israel for 7 years, and then you come to Gideon. Gideon, who rules for 40 years, from 1191 BC to 1151 BC. But of course, you'll remember in the scriptures that Gideon was kind of reluctant. I'm just going to scroll down here. Gideon was kind of reluctant to rule, and so what that happened was when Gideon died, an evil person named Abimelech kind of took over as a judge, and he was there for 3 years. And as a consequence of that, the Philistines began to trouble Israel for the next 18 years. And so it's important to remember that period of 18 years happens concurrently with different judges ruling. Then Tola rules for 23 years. During Tola's rule, the Philistines are finally crushed. And then here in 1128 BC, you have Eli ruling from Shiloh. And he actually co-rules with other judges. In fact, there's as many as 2 other judges ruling Israel while Eli is ruling from Shiloh. And the reason why I think that this is very clear scripturally is that Eli is looked at as a very weak person. Remember, his 2 sons were very wicked. They were fornicating with women at the tabernacle, and they were taking the sacrifices and polluting them. And a lot of people did not like Eli. They looked at him very unfavorably because of the way he let his sons sort of run things. And, Yah tried to correct Eli, and he refused that correction from Samuel's dream. So Eli is ruling here, but because he's looked at as so weak, other rulers also co-rule with him. And so Tola eventually dies, and then you have Jair rules for the next 20 years. And during Jair's rule, you have Jephthah, who co-rules with Jair for next year, 6 years. Now notice Jephthah starts in 1124 BC. That's exactly 1124 is exactly 300 years from 1424. Okay, and remember the scripture says in the book of Judges that there's 300 years between the entering into the promised land to when Jephthah rules. So that harmonizes that scripture perfectly. So that's the third principle that's fulfilled there. So Jephthah co-rules with Jair while Eli is also ruling from Shiloh for the next 6 years. So you literally have 3 judges ruling at once. Now you may say, well, Daniel, I don't see anywhere in Scripture where it says that 3 judges are ruling at once. And no, it doesn't say it explicitly, but you have to kind of read between the lines. And then Jephthah dies here, and Ibzan co-rules with Jair for another 7 years. And then right here in 1113 BC, the Philistines once again began oppressing Israel for the next 40 years. Probably due to Eli's wickedness and just the general sin, every man doing his own thing. Ibzan dies, and Elon then co-rules with Jair for 8 years, until then Jair finally dies, and Elon rules for another 2 years. Elon dies, and then you got Abdon ruling. And then after Abdon rules for just a few years, you have Samson, beginning in 1093 BC. Now, in 1088, Eli finally dies. He breaks his neck. The Philistines capture the ark, and the ark is gone from Shiloh for 20 years. And this is the 20 year of lamenting. And Samuel begins to rule because Samson is enticed and slaved with his own lusts. So that's why I think Samuel takes the reins, even though Samson's still technically a judge. And then 20 years after Samson begins his rulership, he dies here, but also takes down the Philistines with him. You remember that story. And so that Philistine 40-year oppression ends. Samson dies here. And then just a few years later, Samuel has now ruled 20 years. And 5 years after Samson dies, the people demand a king to rule over them. So the people are just fed up. They've had all these different judges ruling them, some of them at the same time. Eli was a big disappointment. Samson was a big disappointment. And they're just fed up. And so, and also Samuel's own sons were starting to behave very much like Eli's sons. So they wanted a king. So then we have the time of the kings that begin in 1068 BC. So King Saul ruled for 40 years, from 1068 to 1028 BC. Then King David ruled from 1028 to 988 BC. And then Solomon ruled from 988 to 948. Now this is perfect because 4 years into Solomon's reign is 984. And of course, it's exactly 480 years from 984 all the way back to 464 when the Exodus began. So again, this timeline adheres to that scripture that's talked about in 1 Kings. And also, what's interesting is 984 would be a Jubilee year. Jubilee years happen every 50 years. After 1 AD, they happened on every 17 and 67. Before AD, they happened on every 84 and 34. Every 50 years. So 984 would have been a Jubilee, which I think is very significant because that is the year when Solomon begins construction on the temple. Up until this point, there had only been a tabernacle in Shiloh, and then it was moved to Jerusalem by David, but it had only been a tent tabernacle. Now we're going to have a temple. And I think it's very fitting that that temple construction begins, this is mentioned in 1 Kings 6:1, on a Jubilee year. And of course, 984 BC is also 480 years after the Exodus. Thus, the Exodus happened in 464 BC, which I already went over. So again, you can see that my timeline adheres to all three of those scriptures. There's 430 years of the children of Israel sojourning in Egypt from the time Jacob enters in 1894 until the Exodus in 1464. There's 300 years between the time of them entering the Promised Land and Japheth ruling. And there's 480 years from the 4th year of Solomon, when he begins construction on the temple, all the way back to the Exodus. So my timeline fulfills all three of those scriptures, and whenever you look at other timelines, you have to make sure they adhere to that. Now, after, of course, Solomon, there's the civil war. Israel splits into the northern kingdoms and the southern kingdom of Judah. And I just followed the Judean kings here. We have Rehoboam, Solomon's son, reigns for 17 years from 948 to 931. And then we have all these kings. Abijah, 3 years. Asa is 41 years. Jehoshaphat, 25 years. Jehoram. This can all be verified by Scripture. Ahaziah, Athaliah, Joash, who was a very righteous king, reigned for 40 years. Amaziah, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah. And then look at this. Manasseh, who's considered the most wicked king in Scripture of Judah, he starts in 666 BC. Isn't that cool? To me, that's just confirmation that this timeline is correct. So Manasseh rules from 666 to 611. 666, the number of the beast, right there, embedded in Manasseh's reign. Then you got his son Ammon ruling for 2 years, and then Josiah, who is the last righteous king of Judah, he rules for 31 years. And then what I have is in 5, and by the way, this is something I don't have in the timeline, but the 18th year of Josiah's reign, which is 591 BC, this is when they discover the book of the law and keep a Passover. And it's a Passover discussed at the end of the book of Kings, where it's talked about how it's like the greatest Passover that's ever been celebrated since the time of Joshua. And that happens in 591, which is interesting because 7 years later would be a Jubilee in 584. Anyway, in 580, 2 years before Josiah is killed by the Egyptian king, I believe Josiah has his son Jehoiakim begin to co-reign with him. Because Jehoiakim actually reigns for 11 years, but he has to co-reign with Josiah in order to get that 11 years to fit. So I believe that they're co-reigning here. Josiah's kind of teaching his son how to reign. But then, in early 578, when Josiah is killed by the Egyptian pharaoh, the people rebel and they make Jehoaz, who's another son of Josiah, king instead. And he's only set up for 3 months before Pharaoh comes in and kills Jehoaz and reinstates Jehoiakim, who I believe is Josiah's original choice. He's reinstated by Pharaoh, and technically now in 578, this is the second year of his reign from when he started co-reigning with Josiah, his father. And then in 577, which is when the timeline of Daniel's 70 weeks that I've posted recently, when that starts, let's just scroll down here. In 577 is when Nebuchadnezzar begins his reign. This is now Jehoiakim's third year, mentioned in Daniel 1:1. Then 576 is when Daniel chapter 2 takes place, and then Jehoiakim rebels against Babylon's rule after 3 years, so 1, 2, 3. And then we go to Nebuchadnezzar's 8th year, and this is when Jehoiakim has ruled 10 years, because remember he was co-ruling with his father starting in 580, so now he's ruled 10 years, and in his 11th year is killed by Nebuchadnezzar. This is mentioned in 2 Kings 23:36, 24:6, and then Jehoiakim rules 3 months, and is taken in the 8th year of King Nebuchadnezzar in 2 Kings 24:12. Then Zedekiah, who becomes the final king of Judah, he begins his reign in 569. This is Nebuchadnezzar's 9th year. And then, of course, then we come to this timeline that I go over in my other video. Cyrus the Great starts ruling here. And then here's in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, which is 558 BC. 2 Kings 25, 8-9, the temple's burned to the ground on the 10th of Av. And not the 9th of Av, it's the 10th of Av. Just go to the scriptures, it says it. I don't know why the Jews celebrate 9th of Av. Anyway, Zedekiah is then taken captive in the 11th year of his reign, 2 Kings 25:2. And then, of course, the 70-year captivity officially begins here in 557. Then we go through the 70 years. I'm not going to go over all this again because I went over this in my previous video. So we go through the 70 years. Of course, again here in 490 BC, 68th year of the 70-year exiles, when Xerxes the First allows the children of Israel to go back and to rebuild the temple. And then 2 years later, the 70-year exile finally comes to an end, where the temple that was destroyed 70 years ago, now a new foundation is laid in the month of Zin, which is the month of May, right there. So there you have it. And then, of course, we go through down here to 470, where Artaxerxes issued the decree to rebuild Jerusalem. This is what kicks off the 70 weeks of Daniel. All the events of Nehemiah chapter 2 through 9. And that, of course, begins our 70 weeks of Daniel. And again, I go through this in my other video, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. But we got that first 49 years. Got the temple finished in the 50th year. So we got the 49 years, or 7 weeks of years. Then we got another 62 weeks of years, taking us down to 13 AD, or CE, where Yahshua begins his 3.5-year ministry in the fall of 13. And then he has 3.5 years where he ministers until 17, the spring of 17. People say, well, why do you put Yahshua's death and burial and resurrection in 17 when everyone else is putting it in 28, 30, and 33? Well, not only does it match history, but also 17 is the only year that a major earthquake is recorded by the historian Pliny happening in the Middle East. So powerful it affects Asia Minor to the north, overthrowing 12 cities, including Sardis. So it's the only earthquake mentioned. And there's a major earthquake when Yahshua dies on the cross. So that's why 17C, I believe, is not only the Jubilee, but it's also the year when Yahshua dies and rises again. And it's because of that I believe that 2017 is also a Jubilee. And when after that 2,000-year gap, we have the last half of Daniel's 70th week beginning. Again, I mentioned this in my other video. And then, of course, the end of Daniel's 70th week, 3.5 years later, happens in 2020 in the fall, where Yahshua returns and the resurrection occurs on Yom Teruah, 2020 AD. So anyway, I'm not going to go through all this because I went over this in my other video. So there's the timeline. Again, I'm going to put a link to this below the video so you can study this on your own. I encourage you to be a Berean. I'm not saying for you to take my word for this, but to compare this to scriptures, compare this to time periods that are mentioned in Scripture. You know, the scriptures are very methodical when it comes to dates. The Jews were very methodical when it came to recording times and dates. So go back and check this and see if this harmonizes with Scripture. I think it does. I checked it over and over again. I don't think there are any bugs in it. But go back, check it for yourself, see what you think, and be a good Berean. Okay, this is Daniel John Lee with Torah Restoration Ministries. Website's www.spirittorah.com. I'm going to be coming out with some more timelines as well. And I hope this is blessing you guys. Shalom.